It's all in your head. You don't look sick. Your tests are normal. It's probably anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you. Have you heard these words from physicians, family, and friends? If you're someone who has been swirling through the revolving door of healthcare to find answers about your health, or if you know someone who is going through this experience, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast with Laura Nozicka. Hello and welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I'm your host, Laura Nozicka, and today I am pretty stoked about the guests that I have on the show for today because this isn't a topic that I have jumped into as of yet on my show, and I think it will be pretty interesting for everyone to hear the perspective of an attorney who represents mental health professionals. And I think a lot of time when we think about litigation around medical malpractice, we're thinking maybe about surgeons and specialists, but I don't know how often we think about mental health professionals. And that's why I am excited to have Scott Hammer on my show today. And let me tell you a little bit about Scott. He is an attorney. He received his undergraduate degree at Georgetown University and earned his Juris Doctorate at John Marshall Law School. For over 40 years, he has concentrated his practice on representing mental health professionals. He has considerable experience in handling mental health malpractice cases, risk management issues, mental health confidentiality, contracts, and defense of licensure actions. Scott, he has held leadership positions on the mental health law committees of the Illinois State and Chicago Bar Associations. He is of counsel to the national litigation law firm Wilson Elser, and he has handled more than 2,000 mental health malpractice cases, claims, and events in his career. When not practicing law, and this is, I mean, you're cool anyway, Scott, but this makes you even cooler. Scott hosts Ham Bones Blues Party, a blues and soul radio show broadcast in Chicagoland for the last 28 years on WDCB 90. Did I get all that right?
90.9 FM.
9.9. Okay, very good. Well, Scott, thank you for being on my show. Truth be told, Scott and I have met in the past socially at a Christmas party, actually, and I haven't seen you since. So thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to scaring everybody.
Yeah. And, you know, would love to talk about your radio show too, but we'll keep that for the end. We'll see. Maybe the mental health stuff is the fun stuff for some people. The blues conversation could be the fun stuff. We've got a good balance going here. And that's what mental health should be about, right? Scott, should be about balance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is unique from my perspective anyway. Luckily, I haven't had to use the services of an attorney very often in my lifetime, at least not for anything earth-shattering or medically related. But I think it's pretty interesting that you have this niche with mental health professionals. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how mental health professionals became your clientele and what's interesting or kind of intriguing for you with this clientele?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I started as a lawyer in 1982. And before that, I was in law school, and I had worked at the Attorney General's office. As part of the Attorney General's office as a law clerk, I was assigned cases at the state mental health facilities, mostly Elgin and Tinley Park. So then I graduated law school, got my license to practice law. And in about 1984, one case came into my firm, and my boss at the time said, "Does anyone know anything about mental health law?" And I kind of said, "I do." And I got one case. And then, like things always happen, you make a couple of connections with the people who assign you the cases. And then I got in 1985, maybe 2 cases, and then 86, 4 cases. And 40 years later, I'm the go-to guy, people say, for mental health issues. Both patients calling me and doctors or therapists calling me.
Oh, wow.
And I was involved in a pretty big case back in the late 80s, which kind of made me somewhat famous or infamous, depending on position. And that's
Well, I think you're a big deal, Scott. So, what can I say?
so what's interesting, when I first started back in the ice age, before computers, um, no one would sue their mental health provider. It was kind of like suing, your priest or your rabbi. You just didn't do it. In fact, back then, people who would go to psychiatrist's office or therapist's office would go in one door, but when they left the office, they'd come out another door so people wouldn't see them. The entrance and exit separately. And it was like under the cover of darkness. You would never tell anyone you were under mental health treatment. It was a stick.
Mm-hmm.
No one would admit to it. And if they did, they were ashamed. To this day, still true. But nowadays, people, go on Instagram or their social media and they talk about their experiences, good or bad. I had sex with my therapist.
That's
It's out there. And
it's like the world is your therapist now, right? Everyone knows. Yep.
exactly. And on the one hand, I think it's good that people could acknowledge they're seeking mental health treatment or in mental health treatment, and they're not embarrassed with it. There's still some stigma about it for some people, and there are more people seeking mental health treatment now than ever before. And with the greater amount of treatment and greater amount of people who would admit to going to treatment, there are more issues that come up legally that both patients and clinicians need attorneys for. In the old days, like no one would ever sue a psychiatrist, but now no big deal. Let's put it out there, see what happens.
Yeah. Well, we continue to be a litigious society no matter what. So,
Thankfully,
yeah. Keeps you gainfully employed, doesn't it, Scott?
it does.
Kudos to you. Because when we talk about therapist is a big umbrella, kind of a big bucket. So who all would fall into that bucket if we had to kind of parse it out just so everyone understands?
Sure. So usually the way I describe it is there are physicians, MDs, who are psychiatrists. And then we have psychologists who are not MDs, and I consider them therapists, along with licensed clinical social workers, licensed clinical professional counselors, and also the LMFTs who do the family work a lot, licensed marital therapists. Those are the general ballpark of the therapists and the psychiatrists. It's a little mixture now because now other people could write, who have prescriptive authority, it's called. So psychologists now with training could actually write prescriptions for psychotropic.
Oh, okay. So it's not just the psychiatrists, the MDs.
Not anymore. And also now a lot of, there's a big a flood of advanced practice nurses coming in and writing prescriptions for many people. So I'm kind of an old school guy. I like both the mixture of therapy, talk therapy, traditional psychotherapy, and medication. Too many people try to rely on the magic pill, which there's not a magic pill usually, although I'm a big fan of, correct psychotropic medications being prescribed appropriately to help someone. But to me, kind of an older, psychoanalytical guy, right? You also need to get on the couch and work out your problems.
Yeah, for sure. And interesting, you mentioned the advanced practice the nurse practitioners, because we all are hearing about this shortage potentially of physicians and nurses coming along and kind of filling those gaps for the medical community.
Yeah, that's how they proclaim themselves. I
Hmm.
know a lot of psychiatrists have a different view of them. But
Yeah. I know. I think I mentioned to you, I do market research for pharmaceutical companies, and I have interviewed some psychiatrists, and there definitely is that little tension between some of the non-MD practitioners out there in terms of approaches and philosophies of their profession. So it's yeah, so never a dull moment, in other words, when it comes to the mental health profession. And like I said, I don't think people really think about, like you said, you would never think about suing your therapist, and because yeah, in very old school, like you said, you have to be, pardon me, like a lot of people think you have to be bat crap crazy to see a counselor or a therapist, and times have really changed.
I think for the better too.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so Scott, um, I know you've got a bunch of different stories, but and we talked about some of them at the party where we met, but talk a little bit first about some of the reasons why mental health professionals may get sued.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So throughout the years, the number one, we'll say, cause of action, the reason mental health professionals get sued, and this has been consistent throughout my 40 years of practice, is suicide cases,
Mm.
where a family member will unfortunately kill themselves, and the family, there's a lot of grief involved. There's a lot of, internal reflection, hopefully. And there's also a lot of anger. And the number one reason that mental health providers, as a general term, get sued, and by the way, psychiatrists get sued more often than the other therapists I mentioned,
Mhm.
is because of suicide cases, that somehow the family believes the doctor should have predicted and prevented the suicide. And those are always very difficult cases. I've handled probably over 200 of those in my career. And they're always very tough because the family has lost little Johnny.
Mhm.
The doctor may or may not have done, something not correct within the standard of care, is the term of art we use in the legal community. But it's always very tragic, because no one wants to see any family member die by suicide. And of all things, it's funny, we, as a medical community, we've improved our treatment of, curing cancer, of curing other systemic disorders. But with all the tests and all the, let's say, science, for some reason, there's no, let's say, magic crystal ball
Mhm.
that will tell any psychiatrist at any time that this patient will commit suicide on this day. I always say when I talk to people is that although we have machines like MRIs or CAT scans that could take a picture of your brain, we could read the brain, but we can't read people's minds.
Mm.
And, there's been a lot of work on, reasons for suicide and how we can prevent them. And it's just, it's a tough thing to predict and a tough thing to prevent. And those are very difficult cases to handle. Even though they could be defensible or not, it's still different than a lot of other malpractice cases because someone has taken their life, and usually in pretty dramatic fashion. Everything from people hanging themselves to
Mm.
shooting themselves to overdosing, either intentionally or maybe accidentally, to jumping off buildings, to every any way you could think. I mean, I had a case of a suicide by a muffin. You wouldn't think you could die by muffins, but I had that happen. Someone
Oh,
purpose.
do tell. How much detail can you get into that?
Yeah, it was an inpatient thing, and they served breakfast with plastic wrapped muffins, and a patient shoved that thing right in their mouth to kill themselves. And they were successful.
So
Nobody's
was it suffocation then? Or
yeah, it's
yeah,
suffocation or they
uh-huh.
aspirated or something like that
Aspirated,
going on.
yep.
But
Mhm. Oh my.
But, you try to think, what ways could someone kill themselves? And you never think of, death by muffin. But it happens. Unfortunately, people who either are so psychotic they're not thinking straight or just want to kill themselves, it's a very hard situation to prevent that,
Mm.
especially as outpatients, because they're not under 24/7 care and observation and monitoring. So those are very difficult cases. Other cases where psychiatrists and mental health providers get sued it's funny now, but a breach of confidentiality is a big issue, right? So, you know, uh, a patient will go on, YouTube and start talking about, again, having sex with their patient. But if a therapist or psychiatrist, I'll just say a mental health provider,
Mhm.
uh, breaches their confidentiality. Oh, are they, hey, you do anything you want, but don't let people know I'm in therapy. I'll let them know I'm in therapy, not you. And now we can talk about this later, but now with, the World Wide Web and internet, there's a lot more breaches of confidentiality because people were sending emails to their own patients all the time,
Mm,
you know,
mhm.
and things like that. So breach of confidentiality is a big issue. The classic boundary issues are still, out there. The sort of boundary issues, when you think of it in terms of how normally you see it, is therapists having sex with patients.
Mhm.
And that's due to transfers and countertransfers and positions of power. And, those are terrible cases because you shouldn't do that. You know, doctors taking advantage of people who are, we'll say, um, you know, uh, victims for sure, taking advantage of their power position. That's bad. Those are terrible cases. But there are other boundary issue cases that come out now as social mores get a little more relaxed, as everything is, go into dinner with your therapist. I have a case right now where a psychologist of mine got asked to go to his teenage patient's graduation from high school dinner with the family of the patient.
Oh
And
my.
he went and sat and just was enjoying the success of his client. But that's a boundary violation. You can't go socializing with patients. Uh, Sometimes the patients try to get you to socialize, and other times the doctors try to get them to socialize. It's strange, and uh, there's so many ways there are boundary violations now. I had a client who had a patient who liked to run, and he had another client who was a high school kid who just started running, and he had a here, hey, I could introduce these two patients. They could go running together.
Mm.
I always say that from the heart, they're doing the right thing, but by the head, they're not thinking.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
be introducing one patient to another patient.
Well,
Although,
yes, and
although I
if
got to
they're
tell one more.
yeah.
I got to tell one more. I had in the old days when we used to have waiting rooms and be in there. I had a client who was uh, very well known as I guess someone who uh, was into social development and how to become your full self. And he had a male patient who was, very shy and very withdrawn. And he had another female patient who had the same things. And he purposely scheduled their appointments next to each other, but delayed the first appointment. So they had to sit there in the same waiting room. So he basically hooked up his patients
Oh my god.
without telling them. His heart was in the right place, but his mind was not. You can't be hooking up your patients because they have similar mental illnesses. It's just
Mhm. Yeah, and then what happens when they compare notes?
exactly.
Which
Real quick, let me just go on my thread. So the other way
yeah.
people get sued, mental health professionals, is a lot of times it's adverse reactions to medications.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, People have, especially with psychotropic medications, you can get tardive dyskinesia. When you're on lithium, you get some bad reactions to lithium, and people are not properly monitored. You could get sued for that. And there's lack of informed consent, especially these days. People get sued or licensing board complaints when they're treating children and their parents are getting divorced. In the old days, we'd have a red stamp, we'd write divorce on the files. People would know keep your spidey senses up, because you know, a lot of times the parents don't have the best interest of the child at heart, and they use the child's therapy to somehow hurt this ex-spouse in the court of law. Tell your therapist that dad did this, or the father saying, or the mother, they're both equally horrible. So I'm unbiased, but always very difficult dealing with a child with parents who are not helping or not supporting the child as they should.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. And going back to medication, whether it be a medication error, et cetera. Now there's mental health professionals are treating patients with ketamine, and there's a lot of ketamine clinics now.
And there's some ketamine lawsuits I've been involved in. And this is, I'll talk about the next, something about ketamine next, but on ketamine, the key is they have people who are trained, and they have ketamine clinics.
Mm-hmm.
And if, the public is looking, is ketamine a good thing? You have to go to someone who has experience and has a ketamine clinic. But there are people giving ketamine, out of the back of their car. I kid you not. I mean, there are doctors or therapists who are not licensed to give it, and they're giving it out the same way they're giving out, mushrooms and other psychotropic psilocybal things that, somehow. I had a client recently who was a couples therapist, and the couple was having trouble in the bedroom, and he thought it'd be a good idea to buy them ecstasy and then bring it to their house and instruct them in the bedroom
Oh
after he
my.
gave them the ecstasy.
Oh my. He wanted to make sure that his counsel was working, right?
Correct.
That was, my gosh.
And I was like, when did your boundary issues meter goes up? When you bought them the illegal drug, when you drove to their house,
Oh my
when you
God.
sat in their bedroom taking notes as they had sex. The next morning, the couple decided never to go back to that therapist, but and sued him and brought an ethical complaint against him. So
I mean, Scott, how do you like? I can only imagine. I mean, I can only imagine what's going through your mind when you're first hearing about these cases. Are you somewhere in the back of your mind just shaking your head, saying, "Why did you think this was a good idea? Why are you breaking your oath? Why are you what are you thinking when you hear this stuff?" And then you're having to defend these professionals, air quotes, professionals.
Right. So I'll divide that up in two questions. So since I've handled thousands of cases, I kind of I'm just very flat when I talk to my clients. I take in information. I'm just I don't judge. Maybe 30 years ago, when I heard something crazy, I'd be, "Yeah, the heck were you doing?"
Yeah.
Now it's just another case.
Yeah.
The way I view it is, I got dealt a set of, I got dealt this hand in terms
Yeah.
of defending this case. I didn't deal the cards. I'm playing the cards that are dealt to me,
Right.
and I just defended. I would say objectively and professionally, and also, with strong advocacy for my client, regardless if they are the creepiest client in the history of mankind or the best client in the history of mankind. We treat everyone fair. Everyone deserves a defense,
Mm-hmm.
but it's hard. I mean, it's hard to represent creepsters, and that's my official diagnosis to it.
I like it. Very
Um,
medical legal term. Yes, Scott.
but when I hear, and I've been doing this so long, I think I've heard of every possible, issue involving mental health treatment. And then you get the next call, and you're like thinking in the back of your head, boy, I never heard this one before.
Mm-hmm.
And, so nothing surprises me. And, I treat every case, with the correct, I say, dignity that it deserves, and respect. The thing is, I don't attack the patients. I never attack patients. I think that's wrong. I've had mental health issues in my family. I always respect the patients. There are some lawyers who like to beat up,
Mm.
plaintiffs, sue people.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, if I get a call from, patients, because if you Google, mental health lawyers, I think I turn up on page one. Even though I don't always take those cases, I do listen. I respect what they have to say. And if necessary, I refer them to lawyers who do that kind of work. It's a specialty work. There are a lot of good lawyers out there, medical malpractice defense lawyers who defend, everything from brain surgeons to OBGYNs to podiatrists to dentists. But defending mental health cases is a little bit different in my mind. And you really need a little bit more of experience to handle those than just, I'd say, normal medical
Mhm.
malpractice.
Yeah, yeah,
But
and
that's
it
how
has
I,
and it has to be, I mean, you could say medicine, of course, there's the science, and then there's proof of standard of care, et cetera, but I feel like mental health is kind of subjective in a lot of ways.
it is. So here's how I always talk about that. So uh, if you're defending an orthopedic surgeon, you got a broken elbow, you missed. They put the X-ray up on the shadow box, and you see the line. It's black and white, and you can see. And but in mental health treatment, we don't have shadow boxes. And I tell the joke that if one patient goes into a room with 4 mental health providers, he'll get 6 different diagnoses and 9 different treatment plans. There's, but truthfully, it is a art as much as it is a science. Not every uh, psychiatrist who are treating someone with anxiety or depression will prescribe the same anti-anxiety medication or the same antidepressants. Each one has their own way of prescribing medications. Just because one doctor prescribes, Paxil or Zoloft or Wellbutrin doesn't mean that the other ones are doing it wrong. They prescribe different medications. The clinical judgment, which is the decision made by doctors in mental health treatment, is very flexible, and I think that's good for both the profession and the patients,
Mhm.
because there's no cookie cutter approach that every patient is treated the same way. The same thing with therapists. CBD is a big thing now.
Yeah.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
somebody else. And they have a lot of different treatment modalities that people use, and not everyone will use the same treatment modality. And I have a list. I made a list on a case once about how many separate treatment modalities are there for therapy. I stopped listing them when I got to 50. There's many more. I mean,
Wow.
some are the ones that are used and we'll say scientifically based on scientific evidence,
Yeah.
but there are a lot of different therapists using different types of treatment modalities for hopefully the individual patient themselves.
Yeah.
But you're
Yeah.
right. It's an art and a science,
Yeah.
at least right now.
And some of those modalities, as you mentioned, there's the proven science of medication, et cetera, but then there's some of those things that since I'm the layperson here, I'll just say it this way, Scott, that's considered maybe more the voodoo, or the woo-woo kind of ways to to treating mental health. And that and if you have come across those types of cases, which I'm assuming you have, that has to be even more difficult to sort through because some of these don't have scientific proof or clinically studied clinical trials. Bloodletting was a thing way back when too, but, did we have proof that that actually worked? I don't think so. But but this is very similar because there are some non-medical science, type of treatments or approaches to mental health.
Yeah, that's true. Especially, I mean, the medication is a separate issue, but especially in the therapy. I mean, there's all different things, and it depends like where you are. I mean, there are some who are more trying to think holistic.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, I've had clients who brought in bells, and they would use bells. Others use light therapy. Others use these people. I would say jokingly, they're a bunch of old hippies but since I'm old, I can't say that. Um, uh, but there's a lot of different ways. I think for patients, if you're going to a therapist, my advice would always be to get someone who's traditional, who uses scientifically based evidence models of therapy.
Hmm.
I always say if it's too weird and too out there, I mean, it could work. I'm not saying their treatment modalities don't work. I'm just saying, as a patient, I would always go to someone who is more conservative and traditional, both in medication and in therapy. I
Hmm.
think that's just the best way to do it. But there are a lot of different people have other ideas on what's the best way to treat patients.
There are so many, and some people are. So the name of my podcast being desperate for a diagnosis, some people are desperate for treatment, that maybe they've gone the traditional route as you've described, but now they're so desperate they kind of fall into the category of these non-traditional things, or depends on what you think about, or EMDR or any of those other modalities. And then there's even, way down the spectrum of other things, of like tapping and some things that I've seen I've seen some documentaries where people literally look like they're having a seizure or out of body experience or something. However that was conducted, I don't know, but there are some extremes, I feel, but some people are so desperate at some point that they will try anything, and unfortunately, we all know, whether it's a mental health professional or a different type of medical specialty, there are doctors, let's face it, who will take advantage of a patient in a situation who has not been successful in more traditional treatment, and now they're going down the path of spending thousands and thousands of dollars on non-proven approaches.
Yeah, and those are, I have to say, especially now with social media, they're sometimes driven by, social media. Years ago, they were having like trying to relive your birth. You come out through the birth canal thing. And that was a big for uh I had a doctor who believed in that and then would have for some reason women undress and sit on his lap, and he would feed them a bottle, um, like they were little babies, and he had some reason to believe that was good therapy. Um,
Wow, that, I think, Scott, is a whole nother episode where we're talking about kinks and fetishes. I think that might be where that goes. That's
but
for my other podcast that I'm working on. But
but
Bill,
it was weird is that you know the true creepsters sexually abuse their patients.
yeah,
Just,
yeah.
like, don't even touch them, quotation marks, sexually, but it's weird. I'm thankfully my brain still works correctly, and
Yeah.
you I view things like, you don't do that as a doctor. You don't have your patients undress and sit on your lap. Just
Oh my gosh.
just
Well,
don't do that.
I think, though, that also speaks to the relationship between a patient and a mental health professional, because where, other than family who knows you well, or friends who are very close and they know everything about you, but they might not even know your deepest, darkest secrets. And to be able, in all confidence, to talk with a mental health professional about things like that are, you would just never reveal to your closest friend or family member. That's a, I'm just gonna put it this way, that's a bond that you don't find with anyone. And when you are talking through whatever your issue is, um, that therapist is probably showing some level of certainly of understanding and compassion, and they're trying to console you, help you through whatever your issue or trauma is. I can see where a patient would think about the relationship way differently than just a patient-doctor professional relationship at some point.
Yeah, there's definitely that strong bond when you go to your eye doctor or your foot doctor or even your primary care physician.
It's trust. It's the trust factor. You trust this person
Yeah, but there's a stronger trust.
intimately.
I was going to say there's a stronger trust with the mental health provider because you're really sharing your dark, deepest secrets. Hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
that's they try to dig deep and try to help you to see what's going on to fix your troubles, so to speak. And it is a strong bond, and I've seen it because I've seen it in cases, I've seen it in emails, I've seen it throughout my life. It's a unique relationship. The therapist, mental health clinician, patient. It's the strongest bond there is, and the key to it, even though this is a whole nother issue, is that you can say anything you want to your provider, and B, it will be confidential. That's the key to a strong therapeutic alliance, is you tell them everything, and then him or her not being judgmental, validating your concerns, validating your issues, trying to help you the best they can, but also that there's this sense of confidentiality that they're not going to go out and tell your friends, family, or others, what you're telling them in session.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another way doctors get sued, therapists get sued, is by breaching confidentiality too. So that's always a strong.
What does that look like, Scott? What's an example?
Oh, there's a lot of those. Some of times they are just because you send wrong emails to wrong patients, but other times it's worse. I once had a client who her blessing and her curse was that she talked too much and didn't listen enough, which is not a good thing for her, being a psychologist. But a patient came in for a first visit, and she was a morning person radio disc jockey in Chicago.
Oh boy!
And at the time, this is back in the 1990s, there weren't many morning radio disc jockeys who were women. And in her effort to befriend, to get her trust, whatever, she said to this brand new patient, "Oh, I treat another morning radio disc jockey. She's about your age, but she has red hair." Now, she never mentioned the other patient's name. We'll call her like patient B.
Uh-huh.
But this patient A knew exactly who she was talking about, because at the time there were like 3 female morning disc jockeys and only one of them had. And she looks at my client and says, "I can't believe you just told me that you treat," and she named patient B. And then my client, I never said her name. I can't admit or deny that she's my patient. So this brand new patient, basically, she storms out of the first session. So my client, in a fit of anxiety, decides to call patient B and says to her, "I got to ask you a question. I just had and named patient A's name to patient B and said, 'Do you know her?' And then patient B said to her, 'Did you just disclose patient A's name to me?' So now she's crisscrossing both
patients.
names at the both
Yes.
patients. When patient B said, I'm terminating, I'm not coming back to you. You disclosed my name to her and to me, her name to me." So in her craziness, my client, she decided to write, this was not computer age, she started to write them both letters of apology. So she typed out 2 separate letters, but put the wrong letters in the wrong envelopes. So patient A got the letter to patient B.
Oh no,
Her
she
name and
was.
address, and patient B got the letter to patient A.
Boy.
And then they both sued her. They both filed a complaint against the licensing board. And I told my client, I said, "I'm a good lawyer, but this is a each one's confidentiality to the other at least 3 times." And so that's another way, is, telling other people's identities without even telling them. And then there are other crazy things. I had a case recently where a doctor was with her friend, and she took an emergency phone call from a client. The client was having a panic attack as he was getting on a plane and called his doctor. And they talked, but the doctor was in the car and she had a friend in the car who's, I don't know who it was. And then she talked the patient down. They decided to get him off the plane and everything cooled down. And they made an appointment to see the doctor the next day. And then she had thought that she hung up her phone when the phone call was over, but it was actually still on. And she turned to her friend and said, "Oh, that, whatever. Sam Smith, he's a nut job. He comes in," and she starts talking about the patient to her friend who was in the car with the whole conversation. She never said, "Let me call you back. Let me get private."
Oh my gosh.
I had a client who met his patient at a Starbucks, and they decided to hold the session in the Starbucks. Oh, no, that's not a secure, confidential location. And of course, somebody in the Starbucks buying a coffee saw the patient, starts coming over and sits down, and they continue their session. Like, "Doc, what are you doing?"
And do most mental health professionals have patients, I'm assuming, sign uh HIPAA documents and consent forms upon first session?
Yeah, all will say competent mental health providers should have their clients sign informed consent forms,
Yep.
and HIPAA forms when they want to, seek information, disclose information, along with separate. In my mind, the Illinois Mental Health Confidentiality Act actually trumps the HIPAA
Mm.
laws in many places in Illinois because it's narrower, it's a lot more strict. So if you're following the Illinois Mental Health Confidentiality Act, you're always following HIPAA. But if you're following HIPAA, you don't always follow the Illinois Mental Health Confidentiality Act.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, and again, Scott, probably for a lot of people, depending on their situations, that the relationship with their mental health professional might be the only one they have. And now again, you have trust in this person. They know everything about you. They're helping you. They're again showing you compassion and concern, and maybe they are giving a cell phone number or whatever. And now there's this kind of falsely perceived relationship between the patient and the mental health professional, especially the ones who are crossing the line as well.
Yeah, I think the damage done it's worse than if a doctor, an orthopedic guy doesn't read your X-ray right
Yeah.
because of the strong therapeutic alliance. Like you feel more damaged by someone you have told your deepest, darkest secrets to, fantasies and other ones.
Yep. Yep.
And then how could you hurt? How could you do this to me? Type of thing. And I always say about sometimes the only person in their lives is their therapist.
Right.
I always say that to my doctors when I give lectures at various universities or graduate schools. I always say that you're the guys that will treat the brokenhearted from broken families with broken dreams, and you're the only thing they have in their life because they have nothing else, either due to mental illness or due to other reasons. The only person they talk to is you. And I always tell them, never take that for granted because that trust they put on you is so important. You cannot, again, betray that sacred trust. Is how I always say it when I give lectures.
Yep. Yep. And again, people are so desperate for treatment or to get past whatever it is that's haunting them. And they can go down a bad path, the perception of the relationship, maybe not having a good filter or good judgment on what the therapist is recommending. And then they're going down the path of, again, like we said, some of these more woo-woo kind of modalities or getting involved with the wrong people, the wrong group. And again, conversation for another episode, but I came across online this guru, if you will, was promoting her, kind of inspirational, motivational, be your best self kind of program. and she was promoting these, she had a, oh, what was she calling it? A private podcast. And of course, you had to sign up with your email to get access to it. And I think there were 5 episodes. And I listened to the first one, and it sounded a little weird, but I thought, well, maybe it's just me being overly critical. Maybe me being the critical Virgo, maybe that's just what it was. And then I
There you go.
started getting into the next one, halfway through it, I thought, "Okay, this is not right." She was very damning, very accusatory approach that you are the way you are because your parents abused you and all these things, and I come to find out that one of her clients, if you will, ended up being institutionalized a couple times because of this woman's approach. She became very reclusive from her family. And then she has a nutrition program where it basically depletes you so much that you can't even think for yourself anymore, and you're falling into her again down the rabbit hole. And then when you are so messed up, that now she refers you to someone who specializes in cult recovery. So I mean, it's just astounding that things can go so far, but again, that's pretty extreme. But Scott, I know that you wanted to mention something about ketamine. I think you had a ketamine comment.
Oh, I was say about ketamine is just, it's a new drug. They have traditional ketamine clinics, and as I might have mentioned, I would only go to those people. I would not seek ketamine treatment from just any old therapist or psychiatrist or psychologist.
Mhm.
I think people are out there, everyone is looking for the quick fix. That's the beauty of all these weight loss drugs.
Yep.
You lose weight quickly. Everyone in the mental health field is looking for the quick fix, and they're looking for the magic bullet that will cure their lives.
Mhm.
And back in the day, the psychoanalysts had their patients come in 5 days a week on the couch for years. Now, you look at that now, it sounds crazy. First of all, there's no Blue Cross Blue Shield that would cover that.
Yeah.
But,
Right.
but they believe that to really look at yourself and become better, you had to dive deep in your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And some people were psychoanalysts, analysts for years, and hopefully they got a little better. But now, how long is this going to take? That's the best question patients ask mental health providers. How long is this going to take?
Wow. Wow.
And
And that's the thing. It is a very long-term relationship if you want to be successful. So again, this might be the only relationship that people have ever had or experienced.
it's just difficult because I mean I'm that way. I got a bad foot. I want that thing fixed. It's been bothering me for 5 years. I've been to 7 different doctors. So I had a mental illness that wasn't getting any better. I'd be a wreck.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would always recommend sticking with the, licensed clinics that are allowed to provide ketamine and other, types of things.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of breakthroughs going to come down the line in the next 10, 15 years with mental health treatment, as there always have.
Yeah.
But it seems like the science now is getting better, and everything from they have the electro stimulation for your brain, the transmitted electrostimulation, to other treatments that are scientifically based. I'm a fan of those. Anything
Mm.
that has been, properly tested and peer reviewed is good in my book.
For sure. Scott, what would you advise? I want to get to understanding if a patient, we'll just use the term patient, and the patient is your family member, your loved one, etc. What should the family or the people around you as the patient, what should they be looking for potentially, kind of the signs of maybe my loved one is not getting the right treatment, where maybe something's going awry where you should be concerned?
Yeah, well, that happens a lot, especially as a family member. You want to do this is unique to mental health treatment. Is that this Confidentiality Act prevents any adult over the age of 18.
Mm.
Um, if the patient is an adult over the age of 18, the therapist, mental health provider, can't talk to anybody else without the patient's permission. So that's always the tricky part is how does a family member, even a mother or father of someone over 18, if they're younger, it's not that big a deal, usually, talk to the therapist, find out what's going on, or is the therapist the right therapist for the client? These are very tricky issues. I always say that if there's anything that I would consider, not strictly in boundaries, I would be very concerned. Meeting at Starbucks, doing some, I will say, non-traditional, very liberal approaches to treatment. Those should be red flags, little spidey senses going up on your arms that, is this the correct, proper treatment for my client? And then I always tell my clients, my therapist clients, talk to the family. I'm on big family systems. I always believe that having collateral information from family members is very important and keeping them advised. Usually when there is a suicide case, the parents always say, but the kid who kills himself, if I only would have known, if the therapist would have told me that, little Johnny was suicidal, I would have locked up my shotgun. I would have kept it on the kitchen table. I only would have known. I was kept in the dark. The doctor never told me. I mean, these are the issues that are easily fixable, but also have tremendous jury appeal because no one likes to be kept in the dark. There are cases where a mother or father takes the daughter or son, the child, to a therapist and says to the therapist, don't tell the other spouse. This will be our secret. And so many people agree to that. I think, no, transparency is so important. You can't treat a child for years and then not let the father know or the mother know that's going on. And I get those calls all the time. Like, I didn't know that my child was in treatment. And I'm like, well, why not? Why didn't the therapist tell you that? And this, sometimes they defend themselves or they cloak themselves in this confidentiality. We can't disclose the identity of our patients. We can't admit or deny. But parents get involved, So I doctors don't involve the family. I don't like that at all. Or if they're doing, again, just stuff that doesn't sound right. I hate to say, but it's a common sense thing. Is what the doctor recommending, does it sound, medical? Does it sound scientific? Or is it out there? Some woo-woo voodoo thing, as you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. That's my very technical medical term. Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing, I know this is kind of weird, but like a lot of mental health professionals practice on their own, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are a lot of patients who would prefer to see mental health providers in a group practice. For some reason, they feel and they get to talk to somebody else if they don't like what this doctor's doing. But traditionally, mostly psychiatrists practice on their own back in the day. That's how they always did it. Family members should also, I hate to say it, but, how is the patient doing? How is your child, wife, cousin, whoever, husband doing? I mean, if you see your loved one spiraling downhill, I would take action. I would be proactive. Not that patients can't get worse. And sometimes when you initiate certain treatment modalities, exposure treatment, other things like that, will make you a little worse. Or you start new medications, you do act, a little worse. But if you don't see general improvement over months, I would be very concerned as a family member to anyone in my family who is seeing a psychiatrist. And I would ask for a consultation with that treatment provider and say, what is going on with my wife, my cousin, my daughter, my husband, and say, they look worse to me. Don't you want my input as a family member on what's going on with treatment?
How does
And
that work
doctors,
then, Scott, from a confidentiality standpoint, though?
well, it's a difficult call because doctors, cannot. What is funny? I recently had a case, and it was a wife and a husband who just got divorced in a very volatile relationship. A lot of throwing of objects, a lot of punching and kicking and cussing between them.
Sounds very War of the Roses. If you ever saw
And
the
it
movie.
was, and, you know, you talk to one, the other one's to blame, whatever. It was so they ended up, the husband filed for divorce, and the wife allegedly took a tremendous downhill uh, course.
Mm.
And they would still see each other because they had kids. So they would still, so the husband literally thought that his wife was deteriorating, was decompensating, was in risk of hurting herself or others. And he called the doc and left 17 messages in 1 week. And the doctor never called them back because he didn't have a release of information, which is what you need, is the mental health authorization that would allow you to talk to a third party.
Mhm.
And then she killed herself. And
Oh.
one of the allegations in the complaint was, if he only would have called me back, I would have told him what was going on with the patient. Because as a psychiatrist, he was seeing her, once a month. It wasn't a therapist where you see once a week.
Mm.
And I always tell my clients that the Confidentiality Act does not allow you to disclose information, but you're always allowed to listen. You're always allowed to gather information. And I think many mental health providers don't appreciate that. They fall under this default. I can't admit or deny that she's my patient. Well, if the husband is calling you, clearly knows that his wife or ex-wife was your patient.
Mhm.
Clients, be human. Pick up the phone and return the call. You don't have to disclose anything. You can say, listen, I really can't tell you what's going on, but what do you want me to know?
Mm.
And a lot of therapists don't do that because I don't have a release. I can't talk to this person. I always tell them, be human. If someone is calling you 17 times in 1 week, human decency would require you to call them back, regardless of the confidentiality.
Wow.
You're always allowed to just to return a phone call. You can then say, I really can't tell you what's going on. But, so I think somehow in graduate school, it's get like plowed into their heads. You can't breach confidentiality for any reason. I don't want to hide behind the Confidentiality Act. I think there's ways to be human and find out information that can help you treat the patient in question.
Mhm. Yeah, especially when you see behavior changes like that, or unusual routines, or routine is different now. And yeah, well, I give that soon to be ex-husband a lot of credit for doing what he did. He, at least, like you said, was being human. But then I would wonder, if you're a guy who calls somebody 17 times, I might be questioning what you're like to live with
Well,
too. Maybe
and,
there's a reason she ended up, unfortunately, committing suicide.
and that was a very black and white case because his
Mhm.
story was exactly the opposite what she was telling the doctor. It's really interesting.
Oh, wow.
And
That's
and there was some other issues going, which I
yeah.
won't want to describe. One of which that he kicked his wife out of his house, and then had adult entertainment dancer move in with him
Oh, okay.
and his two sons, and force his wife to move into the adult entertainer's apartment. So they swapped.
They swapped. Well, okay. Um, Boy, interesting. So
Yes, that was.
so you weren't the divorce attorney on that then, were
No, I
you?
was defending the doctor who was sued for failing to predict and prevent the suicide.
Oh, so this was the same couple you're referring to.
It's a
Oh,
suicide case.
well, sadly for her, I could see why she landed where she landed. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
In
probably.
each case, it's hard to
Wow.
explain. In these cases, nothing is just as it appears or straightforward. There are so many moving objects and issues and stressors and history and uh, you know um, addictions and comorbidity. And
Yeah.
there's just every patient brings to the table a unique set of circumstances that cannot be replicated by another patient. And
Mhm.
that's just because we're all individuals. And, the therapists and the doctors who are treating the really tough patients. I take my hat off to them. These are difficult cases. And we're not even talking about getting into the borderline patients, the personality disorders,
Sure.
the narcissists, other types of personality disorders that make it even more difficult, to treat because it's very hard. And it's rewarding when they treat them well, but also sometimes it's a landmine and you just try to get through it without blowing up yourself or the patient. These are hard things to do. It's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not an
Yeah.
easy profession.
Like you said, those true mental health, psychological diagnoses, where it's a long-term haul of maintenance, and whether it's medication, talk therapy, perhaps it's inpatient therapy, and sometimes patients are just in maintenance mode. They're better than they were, but maybe not cured, if you will. But
Yeah, well, I don't think you're ever cured. I
yeah,
think if you have a real like, where is it? Schizophrenic, which I
right.
haven't really talked about, but there's a lot of cases with schizophrenics because they do, their behaviors are strange. I just had a case where a person was schizophrenic and the person was arrested at least 50 times in their lives. And not really their fault, only that their mental illness became so acute that they did things that made no sense to anyone in the public, and they would just get in trouble based upon their mental illness. So they're in jail, they're in state facilities, they're out. It's this cycling that is very difficult.
Yeah.
There are some mental health providers who will not treat schizophrenics.
Oh,
And I'm saying that badly. I'm just saying they're too difficult to treat. It takes a real special kind of therapist who will take the time and effort to treat severely mentally ill patients. Not just someone with a little bit of anxiety. Not that I'm not trying to diminish that either, because anxiety could be crippling. I know that for a fact.
Yep.
And that could lead to, behavioral changes and things that are very bad for you. But when you're dealing with someone who's psychotic or has psychosis, it just raises the level of difficulty in the treatment of the patient.
So where do your cases usually land, Scott? I'm curious. If you don't want to answer this question, that's fine too. But as far as in whose favor, where does that land typically?
In Illinois, especially in Cook County, the juries are very favorable to the plaintiffs. When I first started 40 years ago, if you got $1 million verdict, it was front page news. I got $1 million verdict as a plaintiff years ago. But now, $1 million verdict is like, you get that for a ingrown, toenail. Now there are verdicts, tens of millions of dollars, $90 million, $80 million. So there's a great risk of going to trial for physicians or therapists because most of them only have $1 million of insurance coverage. And arguably anything over that, if a jury awards $5 million, the individual defendant, the individual clinician is on hook for the rest. There's also risk on the other side that the plaintiff attorneys go to trial with someone who is mentally ill and the jury, blames the mental illness and not the doctor. And then they can spend up to $500,000 or more getting the case ready for trial with experts and exhibits and witnesses, whatever else you need. And there's a risk going there. So this is the lead up that almost over 90%, if not, I think it'll be like 95% of medical malpractice cases, especially mental health ones, they ended up settling before a trial.
Oh.
I don't view a settlement as a win or a loss. I view it as a settlement. It's just the nature of our business that these cases settles. Obviously, on licensing board cases, which I do, again, there's often settlements that result in some type of sanction. But if you go to trial, either in a licensing board case or a regular medical malpractice jury case, the jury will decide whether the doctor therapist is either liable or not liable. So that's where I guess the wins and losses come into play.
Mm.
But most cases settle, but not all of them. I would say each case has its own unique personalities and characteristics, just like every patient.
Yeah.
There's no single one you could replicate and say, oh, I've handled this case. You've handled a case similar to that. I've treated a patient with similar symptoms or diagnoses than this. But each legal case has its own unique personality, sometimes because of the personalities of the plaintiff, the patient, the doctor, the attorney on the other side, or even maybe the defense attorneys. Personalities have a lot to do with whether cases get settled or go to trial or you win or lose, I guess. I generally don't view things as winning or losing.
Then what's on your top 5 list of how mental health professionals can prevent getting sued?
Oh, well, these are things I lecture on because I don't teach it in graduate school or medical school. So I know this sounds weird because it sounds so, I don't know, like a default. But I have to be honest with you, I think having good bedside manner makes a world of difference. Uh, being focused and there for your patient. In a mental health crisis, I think it's more important to actually be there in the moment for the patient. I think it has a lot to do in preventing you from being sued. And also in the same regard, having that same relationship with the family if possible. Now sometimes the patient will tell you, do not talk to my family for a wide variety of reasons. Some of which could be she's in therapy because the environment, or he's in therapy because the environment, I'm sorry to say she, is because their environment, what happened. But I think you got to use, as a doctor, use your therapeutic skill and tact and technique and validate their feelings about that, but also explain how necessary it is for the treatment. I think the development of a good relationship is very important. The second thing is being attentive to your patient in terms of not only the relationship, but also like how is she doing? There's so many times I see therapists treating a patient for 5 or 6 years with no improvement. And have you done an assessment? Have you looked back? Have you sought a consultation with someone with gray hair who's maybe a little more experienced? How do we get off this block? We're stuck. The treatment is not working. Maybe you have to refer this patient out. Maybe you have to get a second opinion because there should be improvement in your therapy or else it's not benefiting the client. And if the client's not benefiting from treatment, then you're not the one to treat this client. And that's always very difficult for any professional to, say, admit. Because some professionals, unfortunately, always say to themselves, I am the only person who could treat this child. That's not true. There's thousands of child and adolescent therapists.
Yeah. Well, doctors are very leery of losing patients to other physicians, of course.
Yeah, or even getting second opinions because they know it all. But as a defense lawyer, I'd love a second opinion. It's another professional saying what my client's doing is okay, meets the standard of care.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a good relationship with the patient, good relationship with family, and being attentive. Like if they have needs, be there for them. I sometimes in the old days when people had voice messages, which they still do, I guess, but I called up my client and the message was as following: if this is an emergency, leave me a message and I'll call you back in 5 days, within 5 days. And I said, doctor, this is your attorney, Scott Hammer. I advise you to change that message because if it's an emergency, you don't call them back within 24 hours. 5 days is not good enough.
Yeah, if a patient is in a crisis, that's a problem. Yeah.
I'll call you back in 5 days. Again, be attentive. Now, some patients are always in a crisis. You got to deal with that. But
yeah,
doctors have a good sense of who is acutely, we'll say, ill, and others who are more chronically in emergency.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be attentive to them. I would, pay attention to them. I hate to say it, but not. Sometimes I get a call because the doctor is getting sued or giving a deposition, which I do a lot of. There's another suit going on. I said, tell me about this patient. Shit you not. They said, I don't remember her at all.
Oh, wow.
You don't remember at all? You saw her in 2003. 2023, like 2 years ago. Yeah, I just can't remember.
Hmm.
Are you just sitting in your office passing out pills?
Yeah.
Or are you paying attention? Are you being attentive to the needs of your patient? It seems so old school to say that, but doctors have psychiatrists or other prescriptive authority. They have 4 patients an hour, and they work 10 hours a day. So in one day, they could see. My math ain't good, but it's too many patients,
It's a lot.
and they don't know. Now, therapists who treat the patient once a week for many years, at least hopefully know their patients.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other thing. The other thing for doctors to not get sued is to stay alert in terms of new laws. Go to seminars. Continuing to educate yourself. Having a lawyer's phone number in your pockets. You can always call them with these hot button issues. I get about 20 to 30 calls a day from doctors who have a hot potato in their office.
Mm.
Or therapists. I have little Johnny, he's 17 years old, and he's having sex with an older person. Could be guy, girl, guy,
Yep.
whatever. A 30-year-old guy hooking up with a 15-year-old patient of yours. And I always tell my clients, call me. I'm very good at defending you after the case blows up and you get sued. And I take pride in preventing, being proactive. Preventing you being sued. Let's handle the situation now. Too often the doctor says to me, I should have called you last week because 7 days gone by and now it's turned into an inferno.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Or
think for doctors,
you're that client who has now sent letters to patient A and patient B and flip-flopped the letters in the envelopes, and now you're really down the vortex of a bad situation.
right. I think for doctors, one way to not get sued is proactive approach to prevent being sued. And that, is go to the right seminars, getting, also, I like doctors having consultation groups. I know that's old, but I have a lot of clinicians who belong to a peer group and they meet once a month, once a year, whatever it is. They meet with other therapists, usually of the same licensure, not always. And they just sit there for 2 hours at someone's house or a restaurant and they just, discuss issues and they get input. And I was like that. I get invited to some of those sometimes to give a little seminar to them.
Mm-hmm.
Being involved with other clinicians as opposed to yourself in your own little kingdom. I think that's a good way to prevent being sued also, because someone else may have a comment that you can say, oh, I never thought of that.
Mm-hmm.
When I get cases and I'm stuck, I call my friends who have all been practicing 40 years. My ego's in check. I don't have to prove anything to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But I roundtable. How would you handle this? How would you handle that? And that is my way of doing what's best for my clients, that I get second opinions.
Yeah.
But for some reason, mental health providers don't like doing it because they think they know this patient better than anyone and they can handle this patient. But I think another way to prevent being sued is, reach out to your colleagues. I think that's important. And staying abreast of the law. Laws change all the time. Confidentiality laws change. I was on a committee for years that we made changes to the Confidentiality Act. Very difficult to pass legislation. But you got to be aware of that. You have to know what's going on. And also keep up with the science. So I would always do that. But I would say the best thing is to be involved and aware and attentive to your patients. And a lot of people who've been practicing, we'll say 40 years, sometimes they don't have the same juice as the first years.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you get beat up in your job.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when I give lectures, I always say to my clients, do me a favor, tomorrow, make believe it's the first day you got your license. And every patient you see, is the most important patient in you. And it gets a laugh because they all know that they have lost that, many of them have lost that feeling that they can make a difference in this world. Every action they take could be the most important decision in this person's life, or a important decision. It's saving a life. I think they lose track of that because they just get, between, dealing with Blue Cross Blue Shield or other insurance companies, no offense to Blue Cross Blue Shield, you're getting squeezed from the top, you're getting squeezed from the bottom. Yeah. And, a lot of therapists, they're in therapy because it's a tough gig. Suicides among mental health providers is not small. They, addictions, alcohol, drugs.
Sure.
It's a tough gig.
What's the percentage, Scott? Is there a percentage out there?
I have that data, but I don't have it with me, and I don't want to guess because I always say if I don't know it, I'll find it out.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But it's true. I am certainly aware of addiction programs that are specifically for doctors of any specialty, but very specific for physicians.
Yeah, through the IDPR, there's a physician's program. I forgot the name of it, but I've sent clients there because they're abusing medications. I'm no prude, but these are troubling things when the person in charge of taking care of someone needs help themselves because of many reasons, and it's unfortunate. I see it happen. But you got to stay, keep yourself healthy is what I always tell when I give lectures. I say to the clients, are you keeping yourself healthy? How's your mental health? Are you seeing someone?
Yeah.
Do you need to see someone? Are you getting enough sleep? Because it's a tough gig. It really is. But I never lose, we'll say, amazing how mental health providers get treated. It's just hard. First of all, it's hard hearing everyone's feelings. It's sometimes overwhelming to hear just, and that's the job. You sign up for it. But, and then the other stresses you have about, payment and rent and everything else, in the old days, you just had to provide treatment to your client, right? That's all you had to do. And I'll just tell this because I always tell it. So in the old days, you have your clients sign in a form and you treat them. It was like, but now I always say this, you have an LGBTQA patient who has OCD with HIV, he's on employment leave of absence under the FMLA, who sues his employer before the EEOC, citing violations of the ADA. His plan recovers an HMO physician, but you're a PPO clinician. And then he asks for his records under HIPAA, and it's enough to drive us all crazy. So
I have to ask, Scott, is that a real case? A real
scenario? A combination of everything that goes on in a daily life. Like, you have all these legal issues going on.
Like, if it could get any more complicated than that. Just to, again, I'm assuming that has happened or can happen.
It's just
that scenario, but yeah.
It looks also different when you see the the initials. But it's a lot tougher practicing today than it was 40 years ago. It really was. There's just so much more going on. And I don't know if we have time today, but
sure.
But the internet makes it even more difficult just because of things that happen during telehealth sessions. But we may have to save that for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, if you want to speak to that a little bit, Scott, you can feel free to talk about that.
Well, I would just say this, that the internet has made everyone extremely unprofessional, both patients and doctors doing visits. Everything from, like, there are patients that call doctors who are still in their pajamas and in bed. But sometimes the therapist is still in their pajamas in bed doing the study. I had one case where the male therapist was treating the patient, middle-aged female patient, over the internet, and his laptop kind of fell over, and he had on his lap to disclose he had no pants on.
Oh.
I don't know what the CPT code is for that or the billing, but Do you have to tell your therapist to wear pants because you don't want to get dressed because it's on the internet? Or, you're in your car. I have a doctor that got a licensing board complaint that she was in her car. She was late to the office, but she had a telehealth meeting, so she did it while she was driving down the Edens.
Hmm.
What's the difference if I'm in my office or the Edens? Again, you're paying attention to your client. And then we have, clients, who are doing bongs as they're talking to their therapist, drinking alcohol. Everyone is so informal over the internet because of how they talk to anyone else on the internet.
Mhm.
You forget the professional relationship between a patient and a doctor. And a lot of that is forgotten quite often. But it is a professional relationship. And doctors should not be in their pajamas, in their bed when they're talking to their patient. It's unprofessional.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's a million other things, flash drives, and blue screens of death, all this terminology.
What's that? What is that?
Well, I had a client once who kept all his files on a little flash drive, a little jump drive,
Oh,
like one
okay.
of
Yeah.
like one of these things.
Yeah, a little stick drive. Yep.
Stick-
Mhm.
And he called me up and he said, I lost my stick drive. And it has 400 patients' clinical notes, all the employer personal information, their credit card information. And he goes, what? That's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is the breach of HIPAA or the confidentiality, that someone could pick up this file and find out the dirtiest, darkest secrets of 400 patients.
Oh my gosh.
So the
Oh
doctors,
my gosh.
and I tell them that, it's a marketing scheme because now you have to call your 400 patients and say that all your personal information has been exposed to the world. So it increased more business. But I was joking.
Yeah.
I did what I normally, and I always tell my clients, let's just think about this for 24 hours. And of course, I get a call the next day and he says, I found that it was in my coat pocket. But in the old days, you couldn't lose 400 patients' files.
Mhm.
A locked cabinet in your office.
Paper on paper.
On paper.
Yeah.
Now, that wasn't a better system. Some say it is, but things are so much more, losable or breachable.
Mhm.
My law firm got breached years ago. So some, ransomware guys did. It happens to therapists, and these are, again, who wants their personal information out on the internet? And we never know where it's going to go because the mental health laws are like 20 years old compared to the technology. I'm not against technology, but new technology creates new, landmines.
For sure.
It's more ways to get in trouble when you couldn't get in trouble that way years ago. I hate to say it, patients just, they have people in their room, they got dogs running through their house, and it's not a professional setting for a good therapeutic session a lot of times. And that's, just when you're in the room with someone, and not that I'm against telehealth and doing Zooms, but there's a certain element of decorum that is when you're in a room with us, one-to-one, alone,
Sure.
no one else listening. You're in the moment and you're talking to your therapist. Telehealth gives patients who have difficulty traveling, they're sick, there's no psychiatrist in that area downstate, gives them, the availability of getting treatment. I'm all in favor of that. But we don't want to lose our professionalism to, keep it as it is if you were in my office. I had a case once where a client of mine, a therapist, was having a session and her patient was a doctor and was a surgeon and was in his office drinking a martini during the session, sitting back, whatever, recliner. And they were talking. He goes, well, I got to go do surgery. And he gulped his drink and ended the session and went to do surgery.
It's so scary.
It would be harder to bring your cocktail shaker into the office,
Right.
to a therapist's office, and prepare your martini. I'm not against technology. We just got to be extra careful As
Yeah.
we proceed, I would say it's, providing psychotherapy in the cyberspace age or the digital age.
Right.
One ways you get yourself in trouble. So you
Well,
always have
and
to,
there's more evidence of the interaction then because it's, obviously it's recorded. I'm assuming it would have to be recorded, and now you can look at body language or gestures or observing what's going on in the background that is more layers onto the case itself.
yeah, that's true. Most therapy sessions are not recorded, but many times the patient records it and doesn't tell you. And
Oh,
then I've had cases where they spliced up the videotape because they're good editors, and that wasn't at all what was going on in the session.
wow. Wow,
So
that
again, how to get in trouble.
crazy stuff.
I had a case once where uh, my client was treating a young boy, I think 8 or 9, and was treating. There was a problem with the father, and she kicked him out of. He wouldn't come in the office anymore. So she saw that he had a gigantic wristwatch on, and he says, the client says to the patient, "Did you get a new wristwatch?" He goes, "Yeah, my dad gave this to me today. Isn't it great?" And it was like a walkie-talkie. He was listening to the conversation in his car through this wristwatch that had a digital not a device. It was sending out the message directly.
Oh my gosh.
So, like, do you have to like frisk your patients that they're not?
Recording, yeah.
You know,
My
yeah.
god. So
So it's just all
scary.
new.
Well, Scott, we know that therapists need to decompress after what they do on a day-to-day basis. Tell us about your radio show. I'm assuming that's your one of your outlets in terms of how you decompress. Tell us about your show.
Sure. So real quickly, I host the blues and soul show on the public radio station WDCB 98.9 FM. It's a jazz station during the day, but at night, on Thursday nights at 10 o'clock, I sneak in there and try to play good music on the radio. I've had 600 to 700 bands play live on my show, and now it's 29 years. Uh, and I like presenting live music on the radio. I think in the old days they did that a lot, and it's live, and it's dealing with musicians and sound, and it's the only not the only fun, but it's like my release. I don't play golf or tennis. I play music on the radio, and I enjoy spreading my love of music with my fans and the public. I've been doing it, like every Thursday night for the last 29 years. So
Aw.
this is my way to decompress. And I always look forward to it. And I never book anything too early on Friday mornings.
Yeah. Probably a good approach. Are the bands, are they live in studio or are they remote?
Live
What
in
is that?
studio.
They are. Okay. Wow.
So we've done everything from a solo acoustic guitarist to 9-piece horn bands. I had a steel drummer once. I'm very liberal on my definition of music. There's only 2 types, good and bad. And I try to probably, but I've had a lot of, you know, and some of the people I've had on are famous blues musicians or soul musicians who passed away. I mean, I had Otis Clay play live.
Wow.
I had Honey Boy Edwards. I had Eddie Clearwater. I had a number of that I feel almost better that I somehow taped them, saved it, and presented it. So the music lives on.
Mhm.
The whole thing about musicians dying is that you present them and you record them, and then you can still play them after they're, passed. And I try to support local local musicians, because they don't get support on big, commercialized radio, where there are guys in New York in a closet programming what you're going to play. These
Mm.
local musicians, it's hard. That's a tough gig, being a full-time musician. And they need all the help they can get, because, the big stations won't play them. But I plug their gigs. I have them on my show, and I really look forward to it. I look forward to having every live band on. And usually the sound comes out real good. I got it down to almost a science.
How do you find the bands that you book on your show?
I guess, 25 years ago, I'd go out and look for them. Now, most of the guys know me or call me or know someone who knows me, or the word gets out, but sometimes I'll see a band and I'll say, "Hey, come play live on my show."
Oh, that's so cool, Scott. Do you have your own website or is it through the radio station or?
Yeah, I mean, it's just wdcb.org, uh, and that just lists me. That doesn't really show anything, tell anything, but the show is broadcast in Chicago at 10 o'clock on 90.9 FM, and also it's simulcast, so you can hear it on the World Wide Web.
Okay. Very cool. Through the website, is it live?
Yeah,
on
just
the
it says, "Listen
website?
here." Yep.
So you can stream it through the website. Very, very cool. Well, Scott, this has been a fascinating and enlightening, eye-opening conversation. This has been fantastic. Any final words or things you want to mention that surprises you about people?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
I hope I passed the audition. Um, I can say this both to doctors and to patients. Take care of your mental health. It's one thing I've learned in 40 years of practice. If you're having problems, seek help, and try to get yourself better. That's it's easier said than done. Believe me, I know it. But don't be scared of seeking help, both for patients and for providers. I think that's important.
Yeah. Great, great advice, Scott. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Well,
Thanks, everyone. This is another episode of the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I'm Laura Nozicka, and keep pushing for answers. Oh my goodness, that's a wrap on another compelling story. Thanks for listening to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. If you would like more information about today's guests or to find out more about Laura, go to desperateforadiagnosis.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow show updates and healthcare news on the podcast's Facebook page. If you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions, advice, or suggestions for our guests, please email me at lauramarie@desperateforadiagnosis.com. Please note, I am not a medical professional, nor am I affiliated with any healthcare, pharmaceutical, or device company. I am an entrepreneur and an independent market researcher focused on helping healthcare organizations better understand the patient perspective. The podcast is not meant to offer medical advice, but to merely share the stories and perspectives of podcast guests.